This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from the Big Apple in the United States. He is a lifelong optimist and founded the Optimism Institute in 2022 after an extensive career in media and sport as an executive, writer, and producer. He is the former CEO of the Weather Channel companies after several years at Time Warner Turner Broadcasting System, where he was the founding GM of Turner Classic Movies and went on to become president of TBS Superstation, a cable television network. He is the co-author of Ted Turner's top 10 New York Times best-selling autobiography, Call Me Ted, and co-wrote, directed, and produced Live Another Day, an award-winning documentary on the bailout of the U.S. auto industry. He hosts his own podcast, Blue Sky, and has recently released his 100th episode and is an inspirational public speaker on optimism. Stay with us as he shares more about what we learn from Mark Twain about truth-telling, key communication steps in the best and worst of times, and how history helps us. We warmly welcome my optimistic and inspiring friend, Bill Burke, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. So, Bill, my friend, it's such a joy to be back with you. I'm sorry it's taken a little while for us to get this together, but I'm so excited to be talking about optimism today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
That's great. You know, I thought as a starting point, you've had a fantastic career. I know, it's been an interesting series of building blocks. I mean, you spent many years at Times Warner and, the Turner Broadcasting System and Turner Classic Movies, etc. You're also a CEO of Weather Channels. Interesting
Yes.
to go from the world of entertainment to weather. And
Yes.
then, of course, coming to Harvard and the Optimism Institute. I wondered for you in your career, Bill, what have been the critical elements of these different building blocks and how have they contributed to your current purpose and passion in the world today?
Well, thanks. It's a great question. My building blocks, for sure, like a lot of people, started in my childhood and with the way I was raised and by whom I was raised. My mother is a born optimist and continues to this day, despite, aging and having some mental challenges, just so positive and optimistic. It's incredible. My father has passed away. He was a media executive. And so I grew up around that business, and I had a role model in him and in his brother and his sisters of incredibly high integrity, impactful business leaders. So I grew up with an idea that business could do good, and that not every business person was a Gordon Gekko insider trading bad person. And so that shaped me a great deal. And then I think I know that working for Ted Turner was a remarkable opportunity because I came from a more formal education background, Harvard Business School. And my first job out of Harvard Business School is with this guy who throws all the rules out the window and also is an incurable optimist. And so I think all of those steps shaped me quite a bit. And then having the year at the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative gave me this opportunity to sort of clear my head. My wife joined me as a partner, which was amazing, and really think about how I wanted to spend these next years of my life. And that's where I came up with this idea of using, in part, my media background, my storytelling background to try to make an impact on the world through this particular work.
That's fantastic. And I know you were also co-author of Ted Turner's Call Me Ted autobiography.
Yes.
Share with us a little, how did you get into that kind of role? What was the experience like? And what for you is kind of the biggest takeaway from Ted Turner's life and autobiography?
There's so many stories about Ted that can only be about Ted, and this is one of them. I was years away from Turner Broadcasting, and I was thinking about teaching, maybe writing, and I realized that I had a ton of lessons that I'd learned from being with Ted that I thought about all the time, and I decided to write them down in a little article, leadership lessons I learned from Ted Turner, and it was like 25 pages. It was okay, not very marketable, too long for a magazine, too short for a book. But eventually I sent it to Ted and his assistant, and I emailed it, and she emailed back within minutes. There's no way he could have read the whole thing. He said, Ted is thrilled. He wants to talk to you ASAP. What's your number? So Ted calls me. He said, hey, pal, how's it going? I said, good. Well, are you still in Maine? I said, yeah, you got a job? And I was working on the startup. He said, I've never been captured that well before. I would want to do a biography, and I want you to write it. I said, Ted, it's a 25-page article. It's the longest thing I've ever written. He's like, I know, but you'd be perfect. So that's how it happened. And my wife literally was getting me books about how to write. I had no right doing it. And it's the way Ted managed people. I had no right running TBS Superstation. They put me in charge of that network when I was 29 years old. I started Turner Classic Movies when I was 26. And so he took chances on people, and that's how it happened. And so the experience was incredible because I had worked for Ted. He was always my boss's boss. But then ghostwriting is an incredibly intimate process. The agent we hired said, he said it's like marriage with the sex removed. And it wasn't, like Ted was into sex with the marriage removed at points in his life too. But it was an amazing experience. So getting to know this man, as well as a very few people on the planet was a great experience. He's a remarkable human being who has made a remarkable imprint on the world in a positive way, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's great. And just briefly, I mean, what was that marriage like? How would you describe it? And what would you say? I mean, obviously, there's so many lessons from him and his leadership in life. What would you say were the biggest takeaways for you? So firstly, how was the marriage? The takeaways?
So the relationship was, we'd always had a nice relationship, and then it got that much closer. He's not the type of guy to have really intimate, close friends. And that was a challenge writing an autobiography. He's not the most introspective person. I think part of what's made him successful is he's constantly thinking about the future and not the past, which is a challenge when you're writing a memoir. It tends to be about the past. We would spend intense periods of time together, 3 or 4 days at a time. Luckily for me, at these beautiful properties that he owns, Montana, Argentina, it was amazing. And I would write, and I would send a chapter to him, and he would edit. He edited very carefully, and we'd had this sort of back and forth. So he was very involved. The best experiences for ghostwriters I've learned is when the principal is actually involved, because a lot of people just think you're going to do all the work. So that's how it went. And then I think my biggest takeaways from Ted, there's so many, but I think being fearless, being optimistic, being honest. One of the reasons Ted is so great to work for is he tells you exactly what he's thinking, and you might not always like it, but at least you know where he stands. And there's so many people who give you this, to your face and then roll their eyes once they turn around. Ted would roll his eyes right at you and go right at it. He was very decisive in his career. He was not slow to make decisions. So those are all things I actually wrote in this article. He also knew how to have fun. And so there were a lot of laughs when you worked with Ted. He could be very difficult, but he could be very funny and very fun. And again, he was an optimist. He took defeat so well. Early in his sailing career, he was a terrible sailor. And every time he lost, he said, I'm not losing. I'm learning how to win.
I'm learning how to win. I love that.
And it's just a great way to approach life. So there's so much I take from him. And I was recently at an event that was honoring him. And I said, and it's true, outside of my parents, there's probably not one single person who's had a bigger influence on my life than Ted.
That's remarkable and a great gift. And you did him a great justice, I think. And what a wonderful
Thank you.
Opportunity to share that with him. And as you say, he's done a lot of remarkable good in the world. You also alluded to the fact that Ted is actually an optimist. You also alluded to the fact that you grew up with this remarkable family where optimism was the code. What do you think, what is your definition of optimism, and what do you think differentiates people glass half full approach versus a glass half empty approach?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said glass half full, half empty, because that is often related to optimism. I actually think that's more about a present state positivity or lack of positivity. But an optimist would look at the glass and say, well, here's where the water is. I can get up out of my chair and fill it up. For me,
Yeah.
optimism is a position of action that true optimists don't just sit around and assume the world's going to get better. They acknowledge that the world has problems, that the path of human history has always moved towards progress, but only because people have gotten out and worked at it. And so I
Yeah.
don't have to explain to you, as someone
Yeah.
who has studied and followed in the footsteps of Nelson Mandela, the power of and it
Sure.
is something I push back on a lot, because a lot of people, if you say you're doing the Optimism Institute or you're an optimistic person, it's like, oh, you just have rose-colored glasses. Like, no, I know this world has a heap of problems, but the path has always been towards progress, and it's only because people have leaned in, usually optimistic people. I interviewed Bert Jacobs, who founded the company Life is Good, and he said, I always
Oh,
challenge people, show me history's great pessimists. He said, you can't
yeah.
do it.
Yeah.
Optimists have changed the world, and I think that'll continue to be the case.
Yeah. So, in your experience and going back to your childhood, what can you take us through a moment in your childhood, Bill, that perhaps was that moment of despair? What particularly happened? Can you share a story? And what was your kind of pivotal moment when you thought, I can shift out of this despair into a place of optimism fueled by action? Is there a moment that you could share with us?
That's a tough one, and to be honest, because I have to be very honest, I had a very blessed upbringing. Um,
Yeah.
but my father was very difficult. He was very tough.
Yeah.
Um, so as wonderful as he was a real taskmaster. So I think for me, I can't point to one specific incident necessarily,
Yeah.
but I feel like I was sort of forged from, you know, privileged upbringing, but not an easy one, if that makes sense. I had a lot of the
Yeah.
material gifts and was my family was comfortable, but it was always challenging. But what I saw was my father, and again his family, my mom's, as people who were incredibly engaged in the community, and that's in the world, and that's what I aspired to. And my mother was more of a traditional homemaker, if you will, but she
Yeah.
volunteered for everything,
Yeah.
from working at the hospital to being a hospice volunteer, and all of those things I think throughout my life pulled me in this direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. And is there a moment where you can remember where Dad was being particularly difficult? I mean, is there a childhood?
A moment?
Yeah. Well, I know you've had
Which time do we have? No, my
no.
father was a wonderful person
Yeah.
with a short temper, and so and he had very high standards for us. Not interestingly, not so much. He was not about, well, you're going to go into business and you're going to be a success. Not at all. In
Yeah.
fact, he would say, I don't care what you do for a living as long as you're honest and you put in a good hard day's work and you care about other people. My dad was the person who treated the janitor the same way he treated the CEOs. And that was all modeled. Some of it was reinforced with words, but most of it was modeled. And
Yeah.
so that, I think, is how I learned these things. And so there was never a time growing up where you felt like you could sit back and be comfortable and not be active and engaged trying to help other people.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're resisting the difficult moment, but that's okay. We'll park that.
No, I mean, there's so many. I mean, my dad was really tough. He,
Yeah. Is there a time that you recall?
oh, there's so many. How to narrow it down?
And by the way, I had an amazing, pioneering, tough mother. So I
You
resonate.
know,
I know what that's like. It
yeah.
is tough. There are those tough moments, and we'll come back to that. So moving around, again, you referenced the fact that both your parents were really about broader community. You referenced that Ted Turner was kind of a thought leader for the future. In your mind, Bill, what is the definition, firstly, of leadership? And secondly, what do you think the future of leadership holds? What are the big challenges?
Great question. I think leadership is the great leaders create a vision for where they're trying to go, and they create room and appetite for people to follow them into that future. It's that simple. And so I think the challenges are numerous. I think that great leaders are great communicators.
Yeah.
And I've never worked with a great leader who wasn't at least able to communicate what was on their mind and what they wanted you to do and where they were trying to take things. And so I think today in communication is sort of the best of times and the worst of times. You know, you and I are speaking virtually. It's an incredible opportunity, but at the same time, you know, people are being bombarded with so much information and so much conflicting information, and people don't trust facts. So I think for leaders to continue to communicate, to keep share of mind with the folks they're trying to have follow them, and to be authentic and trustworthy. It's so important. People are having trouble trusting anyone and anything right now, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
And so I think the best leaders are the ones who are authentic, who the people they are asking to follow them, trust them implicitly, believe the facts they present, and believe in the vision they're creating. But that is not an easy thing to do. So many of our, you know, if you will, heroes have been exposed to be less than that. It's a very tough time, I think, to try to keep inspiring people. But there are great tools to do it, like the one we're using right now. There's so many ways to communicate with people now. But it's a challenge.
It is the challenge. And, you know, to your point, Bill, you come from a communications entertainment background. So you have mastered the art of communication. Can you take us back to an example, you know, perhaps with Warner or Turner Broadcasting Systems, where there was a difficult message to communicate, and just take us through what was that and how did you approach that to ensure that you could take this difficult moment in time that required clear, connecting, engaging communication? What was it, and how did you then craft the communication strategy and share it with your audience?
It's an interesting one. The first thing that pops into mind, the first thing I'll say is I had little to nothing to do with this because it was right when I started at Turner Broadcasting. But Ted Turner has a huge heart, and when things are brought to his attention that he might not have thought of that are troubling to people, he leans into it and tries to come up with a solution. And they still call the baseball team in Atlanta the Atlanta Braves, which is after Native American Braves. And a lot of people were having issues with that, and they still do to this day, the tomahawk chop that they do at games. And we also ran old Western movies with these terrible stereotypes of Native Americans and their plight in this country. And Ted, instead of running from that, decided, you know what? He commissioned this Native American initiative across the company where we wrote a book. We wrote more than one book, I believe, about Native Americans. We did a TV special, this whole way of sort of leaning into that subject and trying to do right by it. He said, listen, and he's so honest. He said at a press conference, he said, this is kind of a guilt trip for me. I feel terrible about this stuff, but here's what we're going to do about it. He was amazing about that. So that's one that comes to mind. The Goodwill Games is another. He started something called the Goodwill Games. It was a response to the Russians and the Americans boycotting consecutive Olympics during the Cold War, 1980 and 1984. He basically said, well, if they're not going to come to the Olympics, I'm going to start my own Olympics and then we'll invite everybody. And he did them in St. Petersburg, Russia. But then the Cold War ended and we were left with this event that actually lost a lot of money. And we decided that we would make it more of a outlet to raise money for children around the world, UNICEF, Boys and Girls Clubs. And right after the Time Warner merger, Time Warner acquired Turner Broadcasting, we were doing a lot of cost cutting. And people knew that the Goodwill Games lost money. And we had a very difficult press conference where Ted, the first question, he was challenged. He said, you know, you guys are laying people off across the company, and we understand you might lose $10 million on these Goodwill Games. How do you justify it? And he said, well, actually, we'll probably lose twice that. But this is a multi-billion-dollar company, and $20 million investment in kids is worth it. And bringing the world together is a good thing. And so we're going to do it. Next question. And so I often think that some of the best ways to communicate difficult issues is to be honest. Mark Twain, I think, said, when in doubt, tell the truth. And I think that almost always serves. And again, it's one of the reasons I respect Ted as much as I do.
So if you could give us the kind of steps of pivoting out of that, you know, you've highlighted the fact that he kind of leaned in, he told the truth. What would you say are the kind of key steps that people could follow, the key takeaways around how then to approach it?
It's a good question. I think the first thing to do is really understand what the concerns are that are being expressed to you. I think sometimes people
Yeah.
rush to think, oh, they're just being reactionary. Oh, come on, it's just a tomahawk chop. What's the big deal? Really try to understand and hear what people are saying about those concerns, because if you don't, you're not going to address it properly. Then I think you have to look at the situation and say, okay, what am I willing to give here? What am I not, and why? Right. So for whatever reason, the Braves are still called the Braves, and those decisions have been made, but you got to understand why and be able to communicate that. And again, just be consistent and honest. And if you need to make a change, make a change. And if it costs your business some money, but it's the right thing to do, that's something that I watched Ted do time and time again. I watched my dad do that in his career, running public service announcements, in time when you could be selling ads and making money. I hear, and I'm very encouraged by social entrepreneurship and all the things that companies are now trying to do to be more pro-social. There have been people doing that a long time. They just didn't always get the attention. It's more of a movement now, but I was around people who were doing that their entire careers. But it's very refreshing to see that happening so widely. So again, I think really understanding concerns, really being honest, and really being honest with yourself about, why am I digging in on this? Maybe this is something we should relook at.
What was the outcome after Ted took that approach?
In the case of the Native American series, I think we created some incredible content that was very well received. It obviously hasn't solved all the issues that this country has with its indigenous cultures, but it was a step in that direction. The Goodwill Games eventually did stop, but we put on these incredible games in New York City that brought the world together and did great things. So I think, they were good outcomes. But with Ted, one of the things he said to me, and it's in the book, he said his father told him that you should set your goals so high that you can't achieve them in your lifetime, which to me is pretty rough advice. But his point was, you always have something to be striving for. So Ted does the Goodwill Games to create world peace. Well, we all know we haven't quite gotten there, but I think he put a dent in it. I'm starting this Optimism Institute. I'm not going to change, fix the world's mental health challenges, but I hope I put a dent in it. So those are the things I've learned, and I think the outcomes, incremental improvement, is what has sort of compounding interest. I interviewed a guy named Kevin Kelly, and he said, if you can improve the world 1% a year over time, that's a big improvement. And it doesn't seem like much in the moment, but it adds up to a lot.
I love the idea of compounding interest in terms of how these incremental changes exponentially build on each other.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, but apart from the communication challenge, and of course we're in this age of mis and disinformation. What is true? What is fact? What are alternate facts? What are alternate facts? Apart from that, Bill, what do you wake up and think about mostly in terms of the current big leadership challenges, not only for the United States of America, but for the world?
Yeah, it goes back to the best of times and the worst of times. I think that our ability to have the world's information in our pocket, essentially, is an incredibly empowering, could be ennobling thing. But we have also opened Pandora's box. We've opened floodgates. I'm mixing metaphors, but there is just so much pouring into our consciousness and our headspace that it's too much. And it can be very overwhelming. And I think it's a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And I think another danger of this is that it can increase polarization. We know it does. So because if I wake up on the left or right side politically of an issue, and then I spend my day consuming media that shares my view and pulls me even farther in that left or right direction, I end the day even more angry or upset than I was when I started the day. And that is a really unhealthy situation, in my opinion.
Yeah.
We are spending too much time consuming information, too much. So much of it is out of our own control. As a human species, we are not equipped, in my opinion, to take this all in. We evolved from people who cared about our families and, the next 5 square miles. And now we're being bombarded with so much that's challenging. At the same time, it's empowering and we can learn and make an impact all over the world. But I think too many of us are just letting it all come in, and we spend a lot of our days very agitated and outraged. And that's not healthy. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge for us to try to strike that balance between the incredible riches and opportunities that are provided by this sort of flat world that has been created, but balancing and fighting against some of the challenges that it presents. It's
Yeah.
a really
Yeah.
interesting time to be alive.
It is indeed, and with much work to be done. Thinking about the creation of the Optimism Institute, where do you think optimism plays a role in striking this balance and breaking this cycle of information overload, increasing divisions, actually, even within the media, these segmentations of target markets where one group listens passionately to one stream, another group listens passionately
Yeah.
to another. Where do you think optimism feeds in, and how do you think optimism can help bridge what is now also a media divide?
Yeah, I think it can play a huge role trying to do it in my own life and how I consume information. So people are bombarded with headlines
Yeah,
and alerts. And it's been described to me that bad news happens very quickly. Good news tends to happen more slowly.
yeah,
And I try very hard, and I encourage others, and I think this is where optimism can play a role, is say, wait a second, don't attack every story with that negative lens. Don't just read the headline. Go beyond that. Dig a little bit deeper. Try to put it
yeah,
into context. Try to put the numbers into context. There was a story in the United States during the pandemic. The headline was American students have lost 30%, are 30% behind in their reading skills because of the pandemic. I thought, wow, that's pretty troubling. Well, then I looked
yeah,
at it. I actually read the article. What happened
yeah,
was before the pandemic, 1 in 3 American students, and this is roughly accurate as I recall it, in rising to ninth grade, were above a sixth grade reading level. After the pandemic, it had grown. First, it was 1 out of 4. Then after the pandemic, it was 1 out of 3. Okay,
yeah,
it's 25 to 33%. And they said, well, that's a 30% increase. Well, that's one way to look at the data. I could look at the data optimistically and say, you know what? We had schools closed. We had parents trying to raise their kids and do their job. And we only went from 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 to 1 in 3. That's remarkable that
yeah,
America's teachers, parents pulled together. And,
yeah,
so a lot of it is just how you interpret and how you sift through the news, and also spend time on news and information that's truly relevant to your life. I think following the latest outrage or crime, or it's very tough, and we should be outraged by mass shootings and all of those things. But when that's all we focus on and that's all we obsess about, it can really spin us down into a tough place. And regarding the media, it's a silly example, but I think it's illustrative. When I was at the Weather Channel many
yeah,
years ago,
yeah,
pre-smartphone. And it's a weird place to work in some ways because your ratings go up when weather's bad. So hurricanes are actually good for your business, which is a strange place to be. But one of the reasons hurricanes build an audience is they have a name, you have footage, very dramatic. Tornadoes, on the other hand, would come and go, and you'd have footage of the wreckage after the tornado. But now everyone's got a video camera in their pocket. So we're getting tons of footage of tornadoes. And because of climate change and those concerns, people now assume that the rates of tornadoes are through the roof in the United States. Facts are climate change will absolutely impact hurricanes. It probably won't impact tornadoes very much. And there are no more tornadoes in America today than there have been in the last 20 years. We think there are because we're
yeah,
bombarded with images of them.
yeah,
And that can apply to so many other stories in our world where just having that instant access to video and data and imagery can cloud our judgment about where the world really is. So that's a very
yeah.
long-winded answer to a very straightforward question. But
It's an interesting example, Bill. I know you've also started your wonderful Blue Sky podcast, and by the way, to
yes,
honor that, I'm dressed in blue.
I
You know,
like it. Thank you.
link to the blue sky. How do you think this messaging, these wonderful people you have on your podcast, how do you think this messaging is reaching people? And how do you persuade people to kind of transition from this spiral of despair into optimism?
Well, thanks for asking, and I appreciate you promoting the Blue Sky podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. My hope is a few things. One is I love the podcast format because, hopefully someone takes 45 minutes out of their day to deeply listen to one sustained conversation. Doesn't happen very often in other parts of the media. It's short snippets of people screaming at each other. That's one. Two is I've purposely tried to speak with people who, again, aren't just, pie in the sky, rose colored glasses. They're actually people working on some really difficult challenges. A gentleman who runs the hate crimes division, essentially, Anti-Defamation League. This is a guy who goes into work every day and sees the very worst parts of humanity. And he's a Jewish guy. Most of what he reads is directed at him and his faith, but somehow he approaches it with this optimistic outlook that we can solve this. We are making progress. So that's what I'm trying to do is to show people that being optimistic means you acknowledge that the world has problems, but you go after them. And I've heard from people, I don't have a massive audience. It's growing and I hope it continues to, but I've heard from people saying, actually, you're kind of moving my mindset a little bit. A woman in our ALI class, her husband, she's like, he's the most incurable pessimist, but you're making progress. And that's what I love to hear. And I just hope that people get encouraged about it. And also, I don't know if Mr. Rogers was ever a thing in South Africa or how worldwide he was, but he was a kids TV personality here in the United States. Beautiful films and documentaries have been made about him. And he tells a story when he was a kid and he would see terrible things on TV or in the news. He'd get very upset and his mother would say, you know what you need to do? Look for the helpers. So when there's a story about the fire or the crime, look for the first responders. Look for the people running into the burning building. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do. When you get obsessed about all the nastiness and hate that's on the internet, look for people at ADL who are going in there and doing something about it and making it better. And that's a message I'm trying to convey.
Well, I think you're doing a fantastic job. And thank you for sharing your blue sky people with us. And,
Thank you.
Turning to somebody we both have a great love and admiration for, Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear in your life, what has been your Mandela moment, a moment he touched, shaped, or inspired how you think and act and lead in the world today? Can you take a second?
I can, and it'll be a blurred moment spread a little bit. But when I started college in the United States, the big issue on campus was divestment from companies doing business in South Africa because of apartheid. And so you're in college and you're turned on and you're exposed to all this stuff.
Which college?
I was at Amherst College, a small liberal arts school in Western Massachusetts. And that was the big issue. And I would hear about this guy, Nelson Mandela, and I'd heard the song Free Nelson Mandela. And so and that's an impressionable time in your life. And so I started to understand who this person was. And it wasn't that many years after that I saw him freed. And then I was living in Boston, whatever summer it was when he came to Boston.
1990. Then he came out of prison.
I would have been I think I was at Harvard Business School. And so to see this man go from, in my mind, a song, this one, his basically like his mugshot picture, to this literally liberated, incredible human being, that was very impactful to me. And then in my years since then, digging in deeper to his story, reading about him, seeing films about him, I can't think of a more inspiring human being and a more optimistic, again, back to, you grow up in apartheid, you are imprisoned, how you don't just crumble and either from hate or despair. And for him to do neither and get out and have the kind of impact he did in the world, to me, is just breathtaking. And to do it with a smile on his face.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in it's all relative. And when I think I'm having a tough day, I will think about folks who are in hospitals and who are struggling with a health issue or who are incarcerated or who, there but for the grace of God go I.
So
Nelson Mandela, you can't pick a person who went through more than he did and came out with a more bright and positive and optimistic outlook, and it's left an incredible legacy.
So having had that exposure, by the way, the mid-80s national state of emergency in South Africa, college campuses around the US kind of taking a stand, and students like you standing up and speaking out. What was it? And of course, when Mandela came to Boston, which was his first year out of prison in 1990, what was it in that moment? And I understand there's so many moments, but is there
Yeah.
something he still did that really resonated and stuck with you, Bill?
I think it was trying to find the best way to articulate it. I just think it was the way he carried himself and his humanity and his just embracing of the world. I mean, to come out of that situation and not be bitter and angry, but instead to celebrate a field of people in Boston, Massachusetts, of all places. I've never experienced anything like it. Country like ours, where politicians come from a certain path generally and everything else, to watch. And also, I think, married with the transformation of South Africa, at least
Yeah,
from our perspective and what we saw change, and talk about creating hope in people.
yeah,
When I talk to younger people about how much the world has changed in my lifetime for the good,
yeah,
the end of apartheid's on my list, along with the Berlin Wall, along with same-sex rights, along
mm,
with curing AIDS, along with there's a list of things that have happened in the second half of my lifetime that kids today take for granted. But Nelson Mandela, I think, embodies some at the top of that list.
How did you feel at the time?
Oh, just inspired and uplifted. And because, I talked before about heroes, and I know that Nelson Mandela was not a perfect man. There'd never been one, but he was darn close. He was a hero. And there aren't many. There aren't many that at a level like his that could inspire people around the world the way he did.
Yeah, yeah. So in that journey, if we switch to coming out of that and how that's partly fueled your own work in the world today, what do you think there is about how he presented himself that shapes the way we need to embrace the future of leadership? And what do you think Mandela would say to our generation and the next today?
It's a great question. And, you're better equipped to answer than I am, but I'll give you my take. One of the things I respected and respect about his memory is that, yes, he smiled. Yes, he danced. Yes, he was joyful, but he was hard nosed and he was serious and he was trying to get things done. I don't mean to keep bringing this out, but back to the optimism. It is not about everything's fine and we're going to dance and have a good time and the world's going to get
Yeah,
better. It's no, I can have a pleasant countenance and I can be a friendly person and I can find humor in difficult situations, but I'm going to attack difficult situations. And that's what I
yeah,
think he'd tell us. Keep your spirit, stay positive, love each other. But, when it comes time to be tough and work hard and be confrontational, you got to do it. And my sense is from my limited study of him is that he struck that balance very well. That, I've worked with people where your first impression is, oh, they're just a pushover. But when the rubber meets the
yeah,
road and they have to, that's what I take from him. And I think he would encourage us all to be that way.
yeah. I think that's very insightful. Shifting to some fun facts, what is one of the happiest memories in your childhood?
I think the happiest memories. I actually loved being at home. I had a wonderful home. I loved my dog. I had these just positive memories. I loved sports, and I was an ice hockey player primarily. And some of my greatest memories were teammates and the camaraderie and the fun of being an athlete. I absolutely loved it. Still dabble in it these days, but
Yeah.
those are some of my best memories.
And those are wonderful memories. And of course, the ice hockey, I mean, I've always admired ice hockey players. Do you still play?
I finally had to stop. My body. There's an old expression. My head was writing checks that my body couldn't cash, and I finally. It's actually been a while. I did have to hang them up,
Yeah.
but I still enjoy
Yeah.
watching it, and
Yeah.
I try to stay active and exercise. But yeah, I miss hockey terribly, but I love watching it.
Okay, wonderful. I love that expression. A second fun fact, what do you think Ted Turner would say about you as something that he really admires about you?
Oh wow, that's he's not always that easy to give compliments, but I think he would say I trusted him.
Hmm.
I really trust. He called me Billy. Not many people got away with calling me Billy, but he said, I trust Billy. And
Hmm.
I always felt that. we had a funny connection with each other, and I think he always knew I was going to try to do him right. And so then that'd be the highest praise I could ask for. I think he'd say he trusted me.
And that's a great accolade. I mean, gosh, to develop that trust and create that bond is an incredible compliment. Coming to Harvard, of course, ALI, the Advanced Leadership Initiative. What has been a moment at ALI that has been truly life-changing for you?
Well, there were a couple. I'm not as good at giving you the pinpoint answers, but I think the day that really pulled our cohort together, and that to me was the greatest part of ALI, was getting to know these fellows, if you will, was with Marshall Gans, and we did his work on telling your personal stories. And it was early. It's been moved around, I think, in the curriculum, but it was early in our group. We were just kind of getting to know each other. We started on Zoom because of the pandemic. Some people were still wearing masks. It was a little bit awkward. And that day, just sort of so much of the sort of shell around us was dropped. Yes. And we watched some of our fellows really reveal personal things about themselves. And we left that full, intense day, I think, so tight. It was pretty remarkable. And to see a guy like Marshall Gans, who, by the way, talk about a guy who's lived a remarkable life of trying to make an impact and lived experience, that was probably the moment. That day was the most memorable for me. And it was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that is. And Marshall Gans is, he's a giant. I mean, he's a moral giant.
Special guy.
Remarkable work. And learning about his, how do we message our story and the story of me and the story of we and the story of now. And I guess, Bill, it sort of feeds right back into your own communications media background about how do we share these stories of me, we, and now to kind of inspire hope and galvanize movements,
Yep.
Yeah. That's, you bring back some very happy memories for me too.
Good.
Yeah, that's remarkable. So in your mind, what is the future of leadership?
The future of leadership, that's a good question. Again, I feel when I think about the future, one of the first things I keep thinking about is just how fragmented things are getting. Yeah. And how, when I was growing up, you followed in the United States, the president was your leader, and whether he was your person, and I'm an American, and I might not have voted for him, but he's my president. And now we've lost a lot of that. So I think the future of leadership is going to be fighting that fragmentation and trying to fight the distractions that people are under and fight the divisions that we have and figure out ways to break down those barriers, to pull people together. These have always been principles of leadership, but I think it's that much harder now. We're just so fragmented and so distracted that I think is a huge challenge. And so I think the best leaders in the future are going to be the ones who can figure out a way to combat that, to use these incredible tools for good, to inspire people for good. Leadership's never been easy, I don't think, but it's going to be a challenge.
And in your mind, what is the definition of bold leadership? What is boldness, and how important is boldness at this juncture?
I think boldness is huge. I think that people want to be inspired by the folks who lead them, and inspiring people are bold, and they take risks, and they put themselves out there, and they challenge the status quo. That's what it's all about, in my opinion. That's so much about leadership is, whether that's a simple business thing like Ted Turner's, like there should be 24-hour news. There's news at 6 and 11, but I get home at 8. And so let's start a news network. That was incredibly bold. To Nelson Mandela taking on an established, political system in South Africa, that incredibly bold. So I think bold leadership is almost redundant. I think it's sort of like show me history's great pessimist.
Yeah.
I just think I don't see how you can be a leader and not be bold.
Okay, so it's not redundant in the sense that it's not relevant. It's kind of
no, exactly. No, I don't mean to put down what you said. No, exactly. I just think it's a huge part of it. I think to step up to be a leader takes boldness. It's a lot easier to hang out in the background. I think putting yourself out there and taking a leadership role is incredibly bold act. or you're, narcissistic and deranged. We have some of those too. But usually it's a real act of courage and boldness to get out in front of a group and not stay in the back. So I think being bold is a huge part of leadership.
Yeah. So in our final few moments together, any final thoughts around the future of leadership broadly? What would you say to our generation and the next? And any final thoughts you think Mandela would share with the world today in terms of his relevance in the world today?
There's a lot there. I think I'm glad you said something about generations, because we spent a lot of time on this in the Harvard program. I think one of the big changes that we're seeing today, and we will going forward, is we have much longer lifespans than we used to.
Yeah.
And that creates all kinds of issues that we've never grappled with before, from healthcare issues, obviously, but also to, okay, well, the old motto was you'd retire around 60, 65 and you go play golf or fish. Well, that was one thing when you lived to be 70, but now it's 80, 90, 100. And how are we going to bridge those generational gaps? I personally resist all this labeling of Gen Y, Gen X, this boomers, this, that, the other. We're all human beings. Yes, obviously, we've all been shaped by different things. But again, another excuse to divide people up. I think a challenge for the future is just to say, okay, how are we going to work intergenerationally?
Yeah.
How are we going to embrace folks at the older end of the spectrum and bring in folks from the younger? All the research shows that there's huge benefits to getting cross generations together. And so I think that's a huge opportunity, but also a challenge that we're going to have in the coming years. And my sense for Nelson Mandela was he was someone, I'm picturing images of him with little kids.
Yeah.
And I'm picturing images of him with his peers at an older age. And so I think being all embracing is not just about color and race and gender. It's also about intergenerational. And I think that would be one of his messages if he were here to speak about it. And very presumptuous of me to put words in Nelson Mandela's mouth, but I'm just thinking about the way he lived his life. I think he appealed to an incredibly broad range of ages, in addition to skin colors and racial backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, do you think his leadership is relevant today?
Oh, absolutely. But I think the work that you're doing and others is important, because you have new generations. My kids, but by the time they were born, apartheid was over. And, it's important to keep telling these lessons from the past that, no, it wasn't always like this. No, we didn't. It didn't always work like this. No, he wasn't always this smiling leader. He was in jail. I was a history major in college, and I am a huge believer. We're having a lot of issues here in this country about people resisting studying the worst parts of our past. Yeah. It's vital to study the worst parts of our past, or you'll never understand how much we've improved. Back to optimism. Yeah. No, it wasn't always like this.
Yes.
We have huge problems, but it used to be a heck of a lot worse in a lot of ways. And so shying away from studying the worst parts of our past, I think, is a huge mistake. And so Mandela's leadership will stay relevant as long as we study the life and history of Nelson Mandela and the country that he came from. Sure. The minute we just take for granted the fact that apartheid is not the system anymore, we've missed a huge opportunity, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, thank you for presenting us, Bill, with the opportunity of your optimism. From the moment I met you, you've always just struck me, you embody optimism. And your work is powerful. And I'm so delighted that you're part of this movement. You're bringing this messaging into our movement. And thank you for you, Bill. And keep shining with your wonderful Blue Star podcast. Thank you for your book. For me, Ted, and we learned so much from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I really appreciate it.
Friends, talking to my optimistic friend, Bill Burke, founder of the Optimism Institute, a Harvard fellow, and the co-author of Ted Turner's autobiography, Call Me Ted, raises a nuanced and important question. What is optimism? Is it a toxic positivity or an antidote to despair? A 2011 epic movie captures the essence of optimism in a nuanced and light-hearted way. The comedy romance The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel tells the story of a group of British retirees Judi Dench, Maggie Smith, and Bill Nighy, who decide to outsource their retirement to an exotic and less expensive India. They are captured and lured by fanciful advertisements of this newly restored Marigold Hotel and imagine a luxurious life in lush surroundings, only to arrive and discover that the Marigold Hotel is a run-down version of its former grand and glorious self. And although their new home is a far cry from what they had imagined, they pivot and they discover that life and love can begin anew when they acknowledge their disappointment, let go of their past, and despite the adversity, remain optimistic. The hotel manager, Sunny Patel, captures it best when he tries to reassure his disillusioned British guests and tells them, everything will be all right in the end. If it is not all right, it is not the end. Optimism is derived from the Latin word optimum, meaning best. The Oxford Dictionary defines optimism as a hopefulness and confidence about the future or the successful outcome of something. But optimism and life are much more nuanced than that. There is no straight line to the top. In this highly competitive world, we often paint this picture-perfect image of positivity, optimism, and success, very much like the high-resolution, beautiful image on the front of a chocolate box. We place high social demand on being consistently upbeat. We admire people when they are at the top of their game. We follow and respect those who have it all, and we get addicted to the good times, the highs, and the wins. We want the joy, the gloss, the smiles. But we often deny or conceal the despair, the doubts, the fatigue, the missteps, and the pain. We do not want the bad news spoken out loud, and all that is well and good. But what goes up usually comes down. What happens when life intervenes, when seasons change and adversity strikes? We deny, conceal, and lose a part of ourselves. Those imperfect pictures, friends, do not appear on the front of the chocolate box. Most people do not want to hear about the hero's story in its messy middle, which is often lonely, filled with doubt, and even depression. Think of Walt Disney. He was rejected over 300 times by bankers and funders when trying to find funding for Mickey Mouse, his Mickey Mouse concept, and Disneyland. He lived off beans. He racked up debt and allegedly had a breakdown after creating Mickey Mouse. But friends, that does not mean that the downers are unreal or do not count. Optimism and life are much more nuanced. There is no straight line to the top. The well-known Austrian psychologist, neurologist, and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl popularized the concept of tragic optimism, which he defined as the ability to find meaning and hope in life despite the pain, the loss, and suffering. Think of Disney today, one of the world's most powerful brands, one of America's most profitable companies, and a company that has generated more than $50 billion in revenue. Optimism is an antidote to despair. It is more than just feeling hopeful and confident in uncertain times. It is medicine for the soul when we hit on the hard times and pull back the curtain. But it requires that we do 7 things. Firstly, acknowledge the tragic triad. Pain, guilt, and death are an inevitable part of our human existence. Secondly, understand that toxic positivity is the opposite of tragic optimism when we reject this incessant need to be positive and accept the realities of human suffering. Embrace those so-called negative emotions. Find meaning in suffering. What is life and this event trying to teach me? What is my purpose? And number 5, channel that purpose to become fuel and energy for hope about the future. Number 6, soldier on, just one bold step at a time. And number 7, redefine optimism in a more nuanced way. No matter the uncertainty, tragedy, or adversity, optimism is the ability to find meaning, hope, and confidence about the future and the outcome. Sunny Patel, the GM of the Marigold Hotel, captured it well when he said, "Everything will be all right in the end. And if it is not yet all right, it is not yet the end." Optimism and life are so much more nuanced. There is no straight line to the top. There is no picture-perfect image on the front of that chocolate box. Toxic positivity is what it says. It is toxic. Tragic optimism is an antidote to despair, which gives us meaning and fuels hope and confidence about the future. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making these thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking that bold action. No matter the tragedy, just one small step at a time. One step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at ann-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on ann-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.